Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 54 of Talkin Truckin with Deaton and Doty. My name is Christian Sneed, and I will be your solo host today. We'll be going through and giving you a market update and all things trucking. Here are some of today's topics that we're going to cover. We're going to look at the market conditions, specifically what they look like in a dry van and reefer. We're going to look at what those market comparisons are now as opposed to previous years. And we're also going to look at the news. What's driving this freight? What's driving this market? And some of the correction that we're seeing in it, specifically related to China. Last week, Mike had asked several good questions about fuel surcharge, so we're going to answer those. We're going to answer how is it calculated. We're going to look through the history of fuel surcharge, starting back in 1994, the breakdown of the calculation and the things that affect it, look at some of the definitions, and also we're going to look at an example today. The last piece is we're going to look at what it looks like between a company's eyes and an owner-operator, as far as whose pockets does the money flow through when it does flow. Generally speaking, we have this thing called up and to the right. And the reason that we label it that is because just like a stock ticker, things go to the right means over a period of time, and then up means that it adds in value. So we generally like to see the market continue to go up and to the right. Well, there's been a correction in the market. We're going to discuss some of the hows and whys and where to move freight, but we have to make sure that we understand there is a correction, and the corrections have happened in markets in prior years. With different circumstances, different pending circumstances. So we're going to label this one down and to the right. We don't want to lie to ourselves and say that, hey, my dispatcher is just not doing as good of a job. There are things that are going to be more apparent as cost of our equipment and to run on the road has gone up. This market decrease is going to be more evident than ever before. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at the van market conditions. We're going to look at a 7-day period of time, the previous 7 days, during two different time periods. The first one is 2 weeks ago when we discussed it. You'll see that on the top right-hand side of the screen, and then I will verbalize it for those that are not watching this on YouTube. On the bottom side, we have today. On the top screen from 2 weeks ago, you'll see that everything basically from Nebraska up to Washington, or if you drew a line between Minnesota and Arizona, everything north and west of that Pacific Northwest is blue. There's not a whole lot of freight moving around at this point. You'll see that there are pockets of red that stretch from Texas, kind of through Arkansas, then it picks back up in Carolina and a little bit of Georgia. Outside of that, the only other thing you saw was kind of the New Jersey, Pennsylvania line. You saw some red up in there, which means that it's a tight market, which is a good thing. Later, we'll cover the difference between a really good market and a tight market with weighted conditions, which is how much volume is involved in that to make sure that we're not one of the guys going over just to pick up 3 loads. But in the bottom picture, you're going to notice some changes here. You're going to notice that Idaho has turned red, that a part of Washington has started to turn yellow, and the small portion of Oregon's tip in there is starting to turn that same shade. You're going to notice that San Francisco is starting to turn red, which means things are starting to tighten up over there in the port, and as you go into Southern California, exactly the same. You're going to notice something else. We talked about Laredo and some of that Western Texas freight. While those markets are still warm, we had a load from Laredo to Dallas, Fort Worth for $1,700. You're going to find out that it's not as available as some other markets are based off capacity, or what we're going to call weighted capacity. There are areas that have dried up. Louisiana, for instance, was a tighter market here several weeks ago than it is now. But there are other areas like Florida, which are doing much better today than they were doing 2 weeks ago, and even Maine. So there is some expansion and contraction in the market. It's not as polarizing as it has been before to where it's beneficial for us based on a load to truck ratio. But you'll also see Wisconsin is lit up a little bit. So we really want to look and see where it is that we want to land our trucks. And if it was something that we were doing here, and you did have berries going into Florida, and you had produce coming out of it at a solid rate, not just a single dedicated broker, but a number of lanes that you had or customers, that would be advantageous. The spot market is still here. It is still readily available. When you're in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and those areas, they still seem to be hitting pretty well, even though they don't carry the most amount of freight in those areas. They seem to be doing well. Here's another week look at it from a 7-day previous standpoint. The top right-hand side, we have 2 weeks ago for what it looks like in the reefer market. And then the bottom we have today. A lot of that is similar. So we see that Louisiana has cooled off a little bit. We see that Florida has warmed up for us, and that's a better place to be. Eastern Texas is still good. You'll find out that some of the Dakota area and over towards Colorado has cooled off, while Wisconsin tends to still be fairly good. And then you'll find that that mid-Atlantic Midwest, eastern Midwest, over towards Ohio and western Pennsylvania is not the best place to be. But we did take a rate out of there as well for a reefer, coming from the Tulsa area going up to the western side of New York for about $4,000. So there are still good pieces of freight that you can get and still run several $1,000s back down to Georgia. But it is knowing the market and where to be. The one thing that we will look at moving forward will be freight waves, and we'll cover that in a little bit. So let's look at what market capacity looks like versus a weighted market. And so when people say, hey, it's a very tight market or it's hot, and we want to make sure that we get in that area, that can be true and false. So DAT provides a lot of information behind the scenes, not just a colored map. And I suggest that you don't just look at a colored map and say, oh, that's red, I need to have my truck sent there. I would look at this. Look at their market indicators. So their index, it actually shows you on a scale of whether it's hot or not, but look at the details below it. It's easy to look at colors, but let's unpack that a little bit. So the first one that we have is market conditions for reefers, which is the prior 7 days out of the Houston market. The one thing I want you to look at is these two numbers below the load to truck ratio. Right here, it's 2,144 loads for 155 trucks. So yes, we have a huge load to truck ratio in today's market. It's over average, which is 13.5. But the best thing is we have a huge pool of loads in that specific area. That's just in the Houston market. That's not Dallas. That's not statewide. That's just in that specific market. We'll look at the same thing in the San Francisco market right now. It's about half as much freight, but then you're going to look about half as many trucks as well. But you have 1,336 trucks that have run reefers out of the previous 7 days compared to the 87 actual reefer trucks. So 1,336 loads compared to 87 trucks, which is 15.5 on the ratio. If we were just looking at a colored map, we'd say, man, San Francisco, it's 15 versus 13. It's got a higher load to truck ratio, so you think you'd get out better. That's not necessarily the case because Houston has twice as much freight. So let's look at Joliet marketplace, which now it shows that the slightly tight capacity, which means it starts to run more in favor of brokers and shippers than it does rates for carriers. It shows a load to truck ratio of 2.4, which is not great. It also shows that there's 712 loads and 294 trucks. So while it's not quite 50%, it's getting pretty close to it. And so that means there are enough trucks to cover that freight, especially if they can roll over some of those tenders. And here's something that gets a little bit of a different optics for it. This is what we mean by weighted capacity. So while we would think that it might be better to be in the Roanoke market than it would be to Joliet, we have to look at the numbers. If we look down below on the load to truck ratio, it shows 457 loads, but it shows 46 trucks. Virginia is a place that you can get if you have customer freight. It's easy to move out of. But specifically the Roanoke market, while it shows that it's hot on the market index, that's not a whole lot of freight. So you think about all the places you might need to go for your customer or the next state that you want to get to, because we want to make sure we run freight in triangles and get to the next nicest place. What if 10% of that freight is only going to the state that you want? So that means you only have 40 loads, but you have 40 competing carriers that want to get in that same market if they're using the same analytics and same data. Now, something to look at here as the market has corrected itself is contract versus spot comparison. And we've done that. In the past, we've looked at van rates. We showed how they were basically running neck and neck through a post-pandemic. And as they run out towards the end of February, they start to split a bit. And so as you can see from the updated spreadsheet on the bottom, that's as of today. I guess technically yesterday when I pulled this up from DAT. So not only did March provide a gap, but that gap also expanded further in April. And what that means is that contract freight is now more valued per mile than it is in the spot market. So while we have taken advantage of the spot market for a good while, and a lot of the spot market has driven an increase in contract freight rates because people were just rejecting RFPs and RFQs. What that does mean is that there's been about a 48-cent drop in dry van rates. I believe the statistics are a little higher from DAT from January to now, which is fine. But we start to look at what that delta is, and that's about 48 cents right now between contract and spot market freight in just April. So we're going to look at that and see if 48 cents grows or it doesn't grow. But we're also going to look at this exact same comparison from contract rates in the spot market to contract rates versus spot in comparison. So as you can see, reefer rates did differentiate a little bit where contracts were below spot. And a lot of that probably has to do with the fact that it's perishable. And when protein is cut and when protein is shipped and when we have things on the shelves, we have to make sure that we meet by its expiration date, or why are we shipping spoiled food, right? And we know that there's cut dates and kill dates with meats and everything else. But what we'll find is in March, they start to overlap. Not only do we have them starting to go the opposite direction, but to hyperextend that, we've also got fuel going the other direction where it's getting more expensive during that same time. And so you'll see that in April, there's a pretty significant difference, about 23 cents. So you have reefer contract rates that were sitting at $3.39 so far in April. And then you've got $3.16 for the spot, as opposed to both of them being about tied, about 3.40, somewhere in there, $3.35, $3.40. Last month, you've seen that not only are they not together, the contract rates have leveled off. And you start to see a slight dip in that because it may follow the spot rate, but spot has dropped below it. So there's several things to take from that. And the takeaway is, where are we landing and how much freight is there? And so what you'll see here on the screen is freight waves. This is their sonar device. This is the van outbound tender rejection index, which is the color. And then you have the van outbound tender volume index, which is that weighted index that we talk about. How much freight is in a certain area? So we want to talk about the rejections. And first, those are the colors. So we want to look at what's blue and darkest blue, which means that's the highest level of rejections, which means the rates typically would be higher because people are not taking those pieces of freight the first or second pass at it, and it's going down through the waterfall effect. Or they're just being rejected altogether because there's other better freight to pick up. And so the area right here, northern Georgia, right, hugely wild. If you look over here on eastern Texas, you have the same thing. It's raised up and going through Oklahoma. So New York is starting to turn blue and starting to raise as well. So we really want to look and keep an eye on both the volume as well as the rejection tenders. And we'll take a look at that in a little more detail, probably do the top 10 or top 20 states next week that have the highest volumes and the highest change in rejection. So what would have been a cool market that now has a bunch of rejections with a 3-day delay from shipment. And then we can say, hey, that's probably the place that we want to send our trucks. Ian's not here today. He's got some family business going on, unfortunately. So our thoughts are with you. At the same time, we want to cover the news and let you know what's going on and what might be driving this market. So one of the things that everyone has likely read about, and likely on FreightWaves because they're covering it, doing an excellent job. Back on April 21st, Greg Miller talked about the Shanghai lockdown and how it's not causing a global supply chain chaos yet. So you look at it's, kind of everyone likes to give a refer to lockdowns much the same way we did with the Wuhan lockdowns in February 2020. So at then it was the 4th largest port that was shut down. Now Shanghai, which is the nation's largest port, is having an extended shutdown as well. So it is causing a little bit of backlog, a little bit of fear about the COVID policy and how China has a zero-based policy approach to it. So this way it's a zero COVID case policy. The port is still operational and the terminals, but however, there are a lot of manufacturing that isn't. So we'll unpack a little bit of that here in a minute. They're saying that the waiting time on export containers has actually decreased year over a period of time. It used to be 3.1 days on March 28th. And now as of Monday, which would have been like the 25th or whatever day that was, it's 2.1 days. So the improvement is because fewer containers are getting to the port in the first place. So their supply to the port is running down, and simultaneously, sufficient vessel capacity is available to handle those export containers. Next, we're going to look at an article that was on the 26th, which was Tuesday, and it says crisis or hiccup. So we're starting to assess whether this is actually going to be a problem or not. Having a port shut down, problem. Having it operational without an economy functioning next to it to get things to that that port is also a problem. Do we rearrange and reroute to other ports? And what does that? Is it going to be a floodgate when things open up? So the one thing that we have here is they say that based on current trends, China watchers say that lockdowns won't begin to ease until mid-May or possibly June. This is kind of like a traffic accident on the road. We've got several lanes that we can carry on. There's an accident in the middle of the road. If everybody stops and we'd have rubbernecking, it's going to back that up for a long period of time. So the longer that these ports are open, but yet their economy is closed, right, or the lockdowns are happening in China, the worse this problem can get. because the longer that rubbernecking lane is, if I brake and the guy brakes behind me and the guy has three cars behind me is also going to be braking. And so what happens, as you guys know on the road, is everybody thinks they're part of Daytona 500. When the cops get the accident cleared off the road, the interstate, everybody goes full force ahead. Well, that's fine on a road when you have open roads. But with ports and shipments of containers, we saw what happened in California, which it helped escalate the market because there was so much freight to have out of California, and there was such a backlog on getting it in here. It was a supply chain issue, right? We had things that needed to come in that couldn't get here, things that were here just waiting around and figuring out how long they're going to end up sitting off the coast. So in some ways, this sounds manageable. The Port of Shanghai is the largest container shipping gateway in the world, and it has remained in operations. Wait times for those, it goes through all the wait times, which is not hugely specific or needed here. But what we want to talk about is shipping is being very materially disrupted. In 2021, we calculated about 6 weeks were needed to recover or get back to normal from flows from every other shutdown. Given this effective shutdown is in its third week already, we can expect 3 months or more before flows are restored to normal levels. And that was from someone associated with FreightWaves. Experts also say that businesses that rely on global sources for raw materials will not be able to fully recover until logistics networks increase their capacity. There is a high risk that many industrial, technology, and automotive companies with their suppliers in Shanghai and Kunshan will have to halt operations due to component shortages. So we've had component shortages on automobiles and things in the past, but what they're saying is that this lockdown could do the exact same thing in other areas. Should the current lockdowns in both cities continue into the month of May, then it'll basically be threats of supply chain issues. So we look at the maritime port-to-port lanes that we have here. So Sonar has that in FreightWaves, and it talks about everything from 2022, where it was up to about 75,000, 70,000, and then where it's at today, which is 14,450. So ocean bookings from China to the U.S. are about the same as it was last year. But they are saying that people are getting nervous. If shippers are really getting nervous about not getting their goods, they should be, in theory, because of the increased number of bookings after manufacturing. So they're saying that basically if you want something to be here for the holidays, you might really want to start looking at that now. And then finally, here's another prediction. So this is the CEO of FreightWaves, Craig Fuller, a guy that has written a lot of different articles. He was the one that wrote one about bloodshed, about what happens if the market turns upside down. He makes a lot of fantastic points here. He talked about the increase in cost. He talked about the increase in the number of trucks on the road. We all know about the cost, but not many people look at what the total count of tractors are from fleets authorized for hire. So he talks about how there's been about a 10% increase during a specific period of time that he looks back. I guess he wrote that article back earlier in 2022 from 1.6 million total tractors of fleets from authorized for hire to basically 1.77 million. Since the pandemic began, the number of dispatchable trucks in the for-hire trucking market, which is anybody able to haul a load, is up approximately 10%. Since truck rates are contingent upon the balance of supply and demand, if the volumes were to drop back to pre-pandemic levels, which we are seeing some of that, with far more capacity of trucks in the market, the rates would collapse. I do believe that. I also kind of have a counterpoint to that, that if we continue to have any sort of ratio where we have more loads than we do trucks, that there will be some sustainability to life. Now, he does go on to talk about how rates have increased, what the cost of the increase is in the equipment and everything else. And this is what is worrisome, and he says that exactly. But even more worrisome is that the operating expense of carriers is much higher today than it was before COVID. FreightWaves estimates that the operating expenses for nearly all carriers have surged as much as 38 cents per mile over pre-COVID levels. This calculation only includes maintenance, insurance, and fuel costs, so not any other expenses like equipment cost or cost of lending and money, which is also predicted to go up. The calculation does not include driver wages, equipment purchase, or finance, which could nearly have doubled to increase the amount of the operating expenses, which means that it could be as high as 72 cents per mile higher than it was in pre-pandemic. So if we ever get back to the same rates we had pre-pandemic, even fuel adjusted, we're going to be in a significant hurt inside this market. But we have to look at where those trucks came from and what type of trucks are in that market. If we've had a 10% increase in the trucks inside the market and 1 million trucks have entered the road, right? What are they? Have they purchased their trucks? Are they lease trucks? When we pre-pandemic, when we had Penske and Ryder, those guys did not have 100% occupancy. They were not running trucks out over 500,000 miles on a regular basis because they could turn them over and get another truck at a significantly close cost to what they had the year prior. Truck costs have increased. We'll also find that as the market collapses, the first guys to get out are the guys that don't have anything tied to it. If my mortgage is tied to a note that I signed on my truck, I'm sticking around and I'm paying that truck off, and I'm going to go through hell or high water to make sure that happens. If I'm in a lease truck and I'm going to walk away, guess what? I'm going to walk away because I can always go for somebody that's going to guarantee me money with a fitted contract rate, which that market, as we say, is still elevated, as opposed to try to bang around on my own. So the one thing we want to do is keep our overheads light. That's if we have every other cost increasing, then what we really need to do is if our costs have gone up 38 or 72 or $1.50 a mile, depending on how you run, we need to make sure we cut back on our spending. So don't get yourself in a whole lot of personal debt. Make sure you clean up your truck, keep a good eye on it, and a preventive maintenance tool. And lastly, he does talk about the cost of fuel. The cost of fuel is the largest viable operating expense in the trucking industry. During 2019, retail prices ranged between $2.97 to $3.11 per gallon. Using an average of 7 miles per gallon, the cost of fuel during 2019 ranged from 42 to 44 cents per mile for Class A trucks. We all know that, fuel surcharge. And then it was incredibly stable prior to that, and then largely as an afterthought, it is not. So let's fast forward to April 5th of 22. The retail price for fuel is $5.10 a gallon. Everybody knows that because every time they fill up, they see that. And at 7 miles per gallon, that equates to 73 cents per mile fuel surcharge. This is a 30 cent increase per mile that will significantly impact the carriers. And he's dead on here. He's dead on. So one thing that we're going to cover today is looking at your deals. Everybody that watches these podcasts come from different sources. Some of them might be just drivers, right, for company drivers. Some of them just might be owner-operators that are a one-man show, or they might be part of an agent program. They might be part of a larger trucking program or direct freight program. So we're going to look at how the fuel adjustments really directly affect you. Excuse me. So to get into that, there was a guy right here. There he is, smiling, driving his truck when he used to drive. Mike Doty, he asked, how is it that we look at fuel surcharge? How is it calculated, and how does it vary? He asked specifically, is there a way that when fuel surcharge goes down when fuel goes up? The answer is no. Generally speaking, it doesn't. So here's some dates through history that we can look at to kind of show you where fuel has been in the past, right? So in 1994, fuel was $1.10 for diesel, right? Regular standard retail diesel prices. In 2000, it was $1.30. So in 6 years, it had gone up 20 cents. And the next 6 years, it had gone up to $3.05 per mile. And then we fast forward just 2 years later, it's up to $4.70. So year over year, I mean, prior to 1994, really to 2003, somewhere in there, fuel was relatively stable. We go to 2016, we got fuel back down to $1.93. I think it was down to $1.70 something at its lowest point. Then we see it start to climb. Not much, climbed by 40 cents 4 years later. So even in October of 2020, right, as we're moving through this pandemic, it was still $2.30 and fairly stable. But then it starts to unwind. In 2021, it's at $2.67. And then we see in 2022, it's $5.25. And then April, $5.16. There's a number of things behind this. Some people will blame Ukraine. Some people say it's supply and demand. It's OPEC. It's fuel. Fuel is different than oil on how it's measured on a capacity basis versus utilization in a national market. But what we do know is that crude oil, as they state, makes up 49% of the cost of diesel. Refining is 23%. Distribution to market is 18%, and taxes are 11%. And looking at that, Mike had asked, and I told him I'd pull up a chart over the years. And if we look at this, there's a chart in front of you. In 1994, it shows that $1.11 for what fuel is. In October of 20, you'll see it start to climb. The higher this goes, is the higher the price of fuel goes. This is not indicative of fuel surcharge. This is just diesel pricing at this point. Then you end up fast forwarding 2008. Boy, that was a good year. You guys remember that, $4.70. And we thought, man, there's no way it's going to get any higher than that. And you can see that it dropped down significantly. It was, just about $2. Then it drove sharply back up to $4. And it stayed that way until about 2014, 2015, when things started to correct themselves. For a good while, it was a sustained drop in diesel costs over time. $2.10 in 16, and then $2.39 in 2020. Then we saw the really big, significant spikes in basically walking into 22 here. With that, let's understand fuel surcharge. There's a couple different terms that we're going to learn here today. One of those is base rate. What is the base rate of fuel surcharge? What that means is, where does all of your calculations start from? And we'll cover that here in a second. And then we have the interval. That word is spelled wrong. It's not terminology, the term. So if we have an interval rate, that means at what price does our fuel surcharge change compared to the pump? There are different customers that have different base rates. And I won't give any specific. I did last week, and I probably shouldn't have, but there are different customers that have different base rates. Some of them might be at the standard $1.26, which is what I've always been known where base rates start, because it was based off of a fuel surcharge of 1.26 as a base rate with an interval of 5 cents per gallon, 5 cents at the pump, changing 1 cent per mile. Let me restate that. I've always been used to $1.26 as my base rate with a 5 cent interval. And there's reason for that, because it was legitimately based around trucks getting 5 miles per gallon. Now, some companies will have a smaller base rate. They'll start at $1.10 and give you a head start, and then they might have a larger increment. Some might start at $1.35 and give you a standard 5 cent increment. So it all depends on what your fuel surcharge is, but it really matters, because at the end of the day, a lot of the fuel surcharge for most industries and customers, 100% provided, right? So if you're running, 72% plus fuel surcharge, if your fuel surcharge is less, then your 72 doesn't matter. So we'll cover that in a minute, but Mike asked, what matters? They both matter. We really want to have a really solid base rate to start upon, where it's not too high and too elevated. And we want to have a fairly small cost to the pump difference before we get to fuel surcharge. So regardless of the economy of our truck, that we have the benefit of having 100%. I can't compete with Henry Albert getting 10 miles to the gallon. If they built that model into fuel surcharge, we'd all be broke overnight, because our trucks don't get 10 to 13 miles to the gallon like he does, right? And there are certain accounts and certain people, that's the way they run. They run 60 miles an hour. They don't carry anything over 10,000 pounds, and they can save money on the cost of fuel. As we talked about a couple of weeks ago, that doesn't mean you're saving money because you're losing out on market share. So if we look at this graph down here, we have everything from 1994 down to April of 22. We look at the price of fuel and where it's at, which is $1.11 all the way to $5.16. If we assume that there's a base rate of $1.26, and that's our starting point, what that means would be, in 1994, we would be below our base rate, so there would be no fuel surcharge. If we fast forward to 2000, it means that we'd be above it. $1.26, or $1.31 minus $1.26 is 5 cents, which means that if we had a 5 cent interval base rate, we'd have 1 cent per mile as our fuel surcharge. Again, let's go ahead and fast forward to 2016. Fuel's almost $2 a mile to $1.98. If we take the base rate out of it, which is $1.26, and we divide by the interval, we're going to find out what our fuel surcharge is, right? So we have 72 cents, which is the difference between $1.98 and $1.26, which means that that's 14 cents fuel surcharge when we're running at a 5 cent interval. So for every 5 cents that changes the pump, it's 1 cent per mile. We can cover that again here in a minute. It's important to know where this information comes from, and that's not a variable. So all of the basis for fuel surcharge, whether it's a $1.26 rate or $1.45 and whatever scales customers and agent programs have, it all starts with www.eia.gov. So it's basically the government compiles, unless the government shuts down for budgetary reasons, this is one that does not stay open, for petroleum and natural gas, gas and diesel. So on the screen, you'll see a number of things here. You'll see on the left-hand side, you have the complete United States, and then they talk about the East Coast with New England, the Mid-Atlantic, Central Atlantic, and Lower Atlantic, the Midwest, Gulf, Rockies, West Coast. So they do break it up by territory in the event that you have a customers in one specific area, and that they have more expensive fuel, i.e. the West Coast. It's $5.70 as opposed to $5.07. So if you need to have that and you say, hey, it's West Coast freight, I'm only going to be, using my fuel surcharge based upon these rates. Because there's a significant difference between fuel surcharge at $5.07 versus $5.70, and it all hits your bottom pocket. The next thing you'll see is a number of vertical columns here. The first one is, it shows you 3 weeks ago what fuel was, $5.07. And then it shows last week, it's 3 weeks prior. So 4/18 will show 5/10, 4/25 it'll show 5/16, and then this is a week ago, and it shows you what the change is. It says that it's whether fuel is up or down. And so you can see that not only is it up from a week ago, but it's also up $2 from a year ago. There's a way that you can look at this through time. The same map that I brought up for Mike and I put into a pivot table, you can just look at the raw data if you'd like to look at, what was fuel the year I was born, right? If you're born after 94, excuse me. Or you can take a look at it and say, what are some things that we could have learned from then to now as far as freight demands and cost of operation? If you need to do that, when you pull up that page, which is www.eia.gov/petroleum/gas diesel, you'll find something called Full History, XLS. It gives you an Excel spreadsheet printout. The other thing you can do is download the image button at the bottom of the screen. I'm not sure why this is not working. But what it does is when it opens up that Excel spreadsheet, it's going to give you everything categorically by the date on the left-hand side. And I'm not going to get you lost in the weeds here real quick, but it gives you the different types of freight for the different periods of time, and you can go through collectively and look at that data. Now, I want to cover deals. That would be different agent deals for owner-operators signing their equipment on places. And this is important. So the first thing is gross revenue matters. People say, well, what kind of percentage do you pay? Do you pay 72% or do you pay 73%? And what's that look like at the end of the year? The difference is, what is your gross revenue? Are you working with a team that can actually elevate how much gross income you have? And the second is, I guess we'll go back to that. If it's 72%, and somebody offers 80%, what's 80% of? I'd say 50% of 100 rather than 100% of 0. So we want to make sure that when you do ask the question of what is your pay percentage, also ask them, what are my expected gross revenues and what is the net that I can expect per mile? Because all that affects it. So you can have a high gross, but if you're running twice as many miles with a high gross as I am with a lower gross with a higher cent per mile, our trucks may be made. Or where are you running? What are the costs associated with that? If you have people that just keep you in the Northeast the entire time, take a look at what the tolls and the fuel costs and the wear and tear on your truck and the paying for parking and everything else really add up. So every deal is different. Also look at what is included in the deal. Sometimes people will say, hey, I'm at 72, but I could offer 65, but but you don't have to worry about trailer rent. At 72%, you have to worry about trailer rent. You don't have to worry about trailer rent at 65. That's a 7-point swing. So when the market's down, it doesn't hurt you as much because it's a smaller portion. That's 7% smaller, so it may end up not being as significant a trailer rent. But when you're talking about $8, $9, $10, $12,000 a week, take 7% of that number. You want to pay $700 a week for a trailer? I don't think so. Nobody does. So just make sure you look at the deal to see what's included in it. Is trailer rent included or is it not? And then we want to make sure that we'll look at the index. What's the difference between fuel surcharges? And we'll cover that here in a minute. What that's trying to say is someone might be at $1.26 as a base rate, and they might have 5-cent per mile intervals. Then you might have somebody else that might be at $1.35 with 5-cent intervals, which means that you'll have a better benefit, right, to having a lower fuel surcharge with the same interval because you'll be 1 or 2 cents greater on every mile for fuel surcharge. It doesn't sound like a whole lot, but we're going to do the math here in a minute and find out. I've been looking to see what they have as far as freight opportunities, 3PL versus spot, and how they calculate their fuel surcharge. So let's look at fuel surcharge real quick and how it's calculated. A couple things we talk about is the base rate. Again, that's the rate of which everything starts on fuel surcharge. Then we have the interval, which the interval says how many cents a gallon at the pump does it change before I get 1 cent per mile fuel surcharge. What you'll find out is that if you do have a 5-cent charge, right, a 5-cent interval, it'll be about 20% of your total price is fuel surcharge. And that covers a truck that gets 5 miles to the gallon. Historically, that's how it's been. So you generally have a pump price that's $1.26. And then as you go about and you say, okay, we're at $1.31, we're at that magic 5-cent number. We have the price increase of 5 cents at the pump, which means that we now have a 1 cent increase inside of our fuel surcharge, which is also, you now have 1% of the overall pump price is fuel surcharge. Now, as you go down, you'll see over here to the right, I have what's called a CPM versus RPG. That is our cent per mile versus our reimbursement per gallon. What this is saying is that the base cost of running a truck with 5 miles to the gallon at $1.26 per gallon is 25 cents a mile. Simple math. As fuel gets more expensive, so does your cost per gallon in that 5 miles per gallon truck, cost per mile in that 5 miles per gallon truck. So the further down we go, with the cost of fuel, right? Here's the pump price, $1.26 going down to $2.51. You'll see that your fuel surcharge increases as well, right? 1 cent, 2 cent, all the way down to 25 cents. You'll see that the fuel surcharge percentage as a pump price is going to increase to cover that, to make sure that you're not spending money on fuel without being reimbursed 100% of that from fuel. So if you have someone that pays you 86% of 100 on fuel surcharge, like someone locally in our area, you are losing money. Your deal, you could have a 75% deal. You do the math, you're not even at 70% because that is not 100% of your money. But you'll notice that the cost per gallon increases as well. And the biggest thing here is if you look at this column, cent per mile versus RPG, that it shows that no, you're not paying any additional money. If you're on a $1.26 base rate, you're in a old 3406 and you like to keep it idling all night and you're getting 5 miles per gallon and you like to have high RPM shifts, well, guess what? You're still covered because your $1.26 base rate with a 5-cent interval change between the pump price and the fuel surcharge covers your fuel. So we'll fast forward, we'll roll that down. Same thing, $1.26 base rate, and all we're doing is saying, okay, here's the current price of fuel, $5.11, right? So here is the pump price increase from $1.26 would be $3.85, which would be an 77 cents fuel surcharge, which is 15% increase in the pump cost. So essentially, it's costing you $1.02 a mile for every mile you run to run fuel now at $5.11 if you have a 5 mile per gallon truck. The good news is if you're on a system that has a 5-cent interchange between the pump and fuel surcharge and it's $1.26, you're breaking even. If you have 9 mile per gallon truck, then guess what? Now you're putting money in your pocket. So let's look at that next step. Here's a base rate of $1.26 with an interval of 6 cents. So now it means that we have to wait for the pump to go 6 cents before we have 1 cent fuel surcharge. Instead of having 20% of the fuel surcharge based on the price, it's now 17. So if we take that same truck that gets 5 miles to the gallon, and I know there's not a lot of guys out there that get it, but if there are guys that are getting 5 miles to the gallon, and it's $1.26 as a base rate with an interval of 6 cents, you're actually losing money. It really starts about 24 cents. Price increase at the pump 24 cents. Mileage change is 4 cents from fuel surcharge. Right, 3% increase in the pump price, which means what? Now you're 1 cent a mile less than you were if you were, paying $1.26. Why? Because the pump price is starting to outweigh your fuel efficiency compensation, the fuel efficiency compensation from any agent program. So the more expensive fuel gets, guess what? The more expensive your truck becomes. So $5.10, our increase from the original, $1.26 price is $3.84. Which means that our fuel surcharge would be 64 cents, equating to fuel surcharge being 13% of the pump price. Again, nothing changed. If your truck gets 5 miles to the gallon, it gets 5 miles to the gallon. It's still costing you $1.02 per mile to run that truck. But the problem is now you're negative 13 cents fuel surcharge, which means you're not covering your fuel cost in your fuel surcharge. It's eating out of your line haul or essentially your bottom pocket. So let's look at a couple of examples here. And I don't want to bore you, but I think it's vitally important you understand that not every deal is the same. And if you can't get a significant earning through a percentage of your agent program, then you need it in the fuel surcharge. And if you can't get it through the fuel surcharge, you need to go ahead and start to get it through your percentage program. Example 1, fuel surcharge difference. This example is any truck getting 2,500 miles a week. So we took 2,500 miles and multiplied it times 52 and got 130,000 mileage annually. Let's assume that we had a fuel surcharge at 74 cents and now it's been corrected to 66. What does that mean? It means our annual fuel surcharge, of which we get 100% of, would have been $96,200 under 74 cents fuel surcharge. At the new fuel surcharge at 66 cents, it means $85,800. So there's an 8 cents variation or difference between the 74 cents and the 66 cents. But the variation mostly that we should see is just $200 a week or $10,400 that's taken out of fuel surcharge and put into a line haul rate. That doesn't mean it's out of your pocket. It doesn't mean you lost $10,400. We're going to do some math here to tell you what that means you're out of. The difference of $10,400 that has been converted from fuel surcharge into your line haul because someone doesn't have equal rates. By the way, it doesn't mean somebody even changed a rate. It doesn't mean someone went from 74 to 66. It means if I'm looking at company A and they have 74 cents for my fuel surcharge at 72%, and then I have someone else that has a 72% deal at 66 cents fuel surcharge, it means it's going to cost me $3,000 a year to work with a lesser fuel surcharge. And here's how. So if the difference is $10,400 what we're going to find out is if that difference that we have between the two competing fuel surcharges, we're going to put that into our line haul and multiply that times 72%, because that's what you're going to get. You're not going to get 100% of it. You're going to get whatever your line haul rate is, which means that the net difference would be $2,912. We take that exact same example, and we do 2,500 miles on a weekly basis, 130,000 miles on an annualized basis. And we have 77 cents fuel surcharge compared to a 66-cent fuel surcharge program. The net difference is $14,300 of total fuel surcharge, which is $275 a week. Now, of that $14,300, again, we're going to convert it from fuel surcharge to line haul, which means now you get 72% of it. So the delta, the difference, is the difference between $14,300 and your 72%, which would be $10,296, which is $4,000 annually. So if you're looking at two competing companies, both offering the same percentage, but have two different fuel surcharge programs, one offering 77 cents per mile, the other offering 66. The difference to you is $4,000 a week. A year. $4,000 a year. And with that $4,000, you can have a whole lot of vacation. The more mileage you put on a truck, the worse it gets. You have 3,000 miles on a truck, annual mileage of 150,000 miles. Taking it even on an 8-cent difference from 74 to 66, that's a $12,000 difference at the end of the year that you're converting fuel surcharge money into line haul. If you're on a 72% deal, that equates to $3,360 annually. So you're losing $3,300 as two different comparative programs. So if we have Landstar Ranger versus Landstar or whatever, and they're both the same businesses, but they offer different fuel surcharge programs, it may look like it's the same because they both offer 72%, but look into the fuel surcharge network. And this is answering Mike's question. Will it ever go the other way? The answer is no. It should never go the other way unless there's a change. We have customers that do change their base rate. We have customers that change the number of cents per gallon versus fuel surcharge. And the reason for that is because of a more competitive and more fuel efficient fleet. So like I said, the base rate of $1.26 with 5 cents at the pump that we've been using forever is 5 miles per gallon because it's a break even over time. Now, at 3,000 miles at an 11-cent difference, and this is huge. So if you're just running 3,000 miles, you're running from Laredo to Pompano back to Laredo each week, and you're running 3,000 miles a week and solid running. 11 cents is going to be about $317 a week off your gross fuel surcharge, which is $16,500. That difference converted to fuel surcharge in a line haul is $11,880, which is a net of $4,600, which means you're making $4,620 less than the same guy getting the same deal, same runs at 72% with a better fuel surcharge program. So know that you got to compare apples to apples when you're going to companies. You have to say, hey, what is my fuel surcharge? And, what is my rate that I want to have? And then also, what does that mean? What kind of freight can you get me? Because it's just as important to have a good net freight, right? You want to have high rates. So the breakdown here is pretty easy. I basically just put it in a giant square that says if we have an 8-cent per mile loss on 2,500 miles a week, it's going to be $2,900. At 3,000 miles a week, it's going to be $3,300. If we have an 11-cent fuel surcharge loss between two competitive companies, it means there would be a $4,000 loss per year that's out of your pocket for 2,500 miles. And if you do 3,000 miles, then it's going to be $4,620. What that means, if you have two competing companies that have the exact same pay percentage, and they also have two different fuel programs, and one is less than the other by 8 cents, and they have 150 trucks, they're putting almost $500,000 in their pocket, $436,800. Just the same that if you end up having someone run 11 cents for 150 trucks or better, maybe it's 500 or 800 trucks, or maybe it's 10. If it's 15 trucks, it's still $45,000 a year. If it's 300 trucks, that's $800,000, $900,000 a year. That's $1 million that they're not passing along in fuel surcharge, but they're putting into the line haul, of which you get a smaller percentage of. So if you're running a less than fuel efficient truck, it's time to upgrade, but it's not quite time yet. Wait for the prices of trucks to go down because you're only going to be gaining $4,000 on a max of your truck. And right now with the elevated elevated truck prices, you're likely going to be having a $30,000 to $40,000 to $50,000 increase in the cost of the equipment, which is not worth purchasing. Then also, if we have mileages of $3,000 for 150 trucks at 8 cents per mile, it's $500,000. It's almost $700,000 to run 3,000 miles a week and get paid 11 cents less fuel surcharge. Not 11 cents less per mile, but in fuel surcharge. So I hope that helps, Mike, answer your question. Anybody, I saw that there's a lot of feedback on TikTok about, what is fuel surcharge? How does it happen? So some buzzwords: base rate. What is our base rate? Where does fuel surcharge stop or start? And I check your contracts out. Find out what the contracts say. They should identify. Now, you're an owner operator, and I've spoken to several people and saw some messages about owner operators get to choose their own fuel surcharge because they're not bound by it. Well, as an owner operator, you do sign contracts, and if you sign that contract, that is what is legally binding. So make sure you check into your contract. I would say the other thing too is have a conversation about it if it's not somewhere that's present. And there are a lot of companies out there that just don't provide the information. Lastly, I know I get really excited about fuel surcharge. When Mike asked that question, it's something I got to learn early on, and it was great to have a refresher there. So Mike, thanks for the question. And one of the last things I want to talk about is we still have the International Road Check 72-hour blitz coming up. That is coming up from May 17th to the 19th. So we understand, like we talked about 3 weeks ago, that the top offenders were brakes and hours of service. So make sure you get your trucks checked out. The one thing I would say is to ensure that, wheel seals, tires, get your dash cleaned up, keep your hours of service clean, and keep everything up to date. So this way, you're not getting a phone call, your manager's not getting a phone call on something you didn't do right. So I want to make sure that everybody knows that we've had our team have some family issues here at the Talkin Truckin podcast. Everybody should be through them, and there's been some illness and some things going on. So our thoughts are with you guys that aren't here today. I appreciate you letting me go through and kind of giving a market update. I'd also like to make sure that I thank those that help bring the show to you. The first one is Truckworks out of Dothan, Alabama, the Kenworth. The others, Over the Road Truck Apparel, work clothes for the modern day working trucker. We have Prime Wellness and Performance in San Antonio, Texas. As always, Al's Quality Meat Market, the best meat in Barberton. Gator Drive-Thru out of Portage Lakes. And last thing is make sure you like, comment, and share on our site. So we do try to do our best to provide you weekly content that is both entertaining as well as educational. And you guys have a great week.